My wife called me at 2 a.m. crying, "Please, don't tell anyone where I am." I calmly replied I wasn't planning to. Then I hung up. The next morning, someone knocked on my door. They didn't ask for my wife. They asked for me. The moment I opened the envelope, I realized she had lied about much more than one night. "Julian," she whispered, her voice cracking, breath uneven like she'd been crying for a while before she finally worked up the nerve to call. "Please, don't tell anyone where I am." I sat up in the dark, staring at nothing, listening to my wife beg me for a kind of silence she had never once offered me in 5 years of marriage. "I wasn't planning to," I said, and I meant it in a way she probably didn't understand yet. Then I hung up. I didn't call her back. I didn't text. I set the phone face down on the nightstand and lay there in the dark until sunrise, turning that single sentence over and over in my head, trying to figure out exactly what kind of trouble finally makes a woman like Celine call her husband crying instead of calling whoever she usually calls first. I found out at 9 the next morning when someone knocked on my door. They didn't ask for my wife, they asked for me by name, with a manila envelope in their hand and an expression that told me this wasn't a delivery. It was a warning. And the moment I broke the seal on that envelope, standing barefoot on my own front porch, I understood that the woman I married had been lying to me about something far bigger than a single missing night. This is the story of how I learned exactly who I'd been sleeping beside for 5 years and what I quietly decided to do about it once I finally had proof. My name is Julian Marsh. I'm 36 years old, and for the last 9 years, I've worked as a fraud investigator for one of the largest insurance carriers in the Southwest, based out of Phoenix, Arizona. It's a strange career to have, looking back on everything that happened. I've spent nearly a decade of my professional life trained to notice the small inconsistencies people leave behind when they're lying, the mismatched timelines, the receipts that don't quite add up, the stories that sound rehearsed if you listen closely enough. I built an entire career on catching other people's deception. I never once thought to point that same attention at my own marriage. I met Celine almost 7 years ago at a mutual friend's barbecue, back when she introduced herself as Celine Cordero, recently relocated to Phoenix from somewhere in Nevada, working freelance in event coordination. She was magnetic in a way that made the details of her past feel almost unnecessary, funny, sharp, endlessly interesting, the kind of woman who could make a grocery store run feel like an adventure. We married 2 years later in a small ceremony out in Sedona, just close friends and her mother, since she always said her father's side of the family was complicated and better left out of it. I never pushed on that. I understand now how strange that restraint actually was, but at the time it felt like respect. Celine had a way of closing a conversation gently enough that you didn't notice you'd been redirected until it was already over. For the first few years, our marriage felt, if not perfect, at least stable. She worked inconsistent hours, often traveling for events I never attended, always with some reasonable explanation for why I couldn't come along this particular weekend. I told myself that was simply the nature of her work. I told myself the occasional unexplained charge on our joint account, the occasional night she came home late without much detail, were the ordinary friction of two independent adults building a life together. I had no real reason yet to apply my professional instincts to my own home. That changed the night she called me crying at 2 a.m., asking me not to tell anyone where she was. Looking back now, the inconsistencies had been there for over a year before that phone call, small enough individually that I'd filed each one away without connecting them into a pattern. About 14 months before that night, I noticed a withdrawal from our joint savings account for $800, paid to a name I didn't recognize, a F. Renfield. When I asked Celine about it, she said, almost too quickly, that it was a deposit for an event venue that had fallen through and that she was still working on getting the refund processed. I let it go. $800 didn't feel worth a fight. Then came the unexplained weekend trips, usually framed as work, usually to towns a little too far from any event circuit I could easily verify. She'd come home distracted, quieter than usual, her phone locked and face down on every surface she set it on, a habit I only registered in hindsight as significant. About 6 months before the 2 a.m. call, I found a folder in her car, not hidden particularly well, just tucked under a stack of old parking receipts, containing a handful of documents with a name on them that wasn't hers. Not Celine Marsh, not even Celine Cordero. A name I didn't recognize at all, Celine Renfield. When I asked her about it that night, her face went through several expressions in quick succession before settling on something carefully neutral. "It's an old alias I used for freelance invoicing, back before I met you," she said. "Some clients preferred working with an LLC name instead of my personal one. It's nothing, Julian." I wanted to believe her. That's the particular blind spot love creates in even the most trained observer. It convinces you the person closest to you deserves an exception from the scrutiny you'd apply to anyone else. The comments started shifting after that, small but persistent. "You're always so suspicious, Julian. It's like living with an investigator instead of a husband sometimes." She said it lightly, almost teasingly, but I noticed she said it every single time a question got too close to something she didn't want to answer. 3 weeks before that 2 a.m. call, I ran into an old coworker of mine, Odessa Chen, who now worked in a different department handling background verification for our company's underwriting division. Over coffee, almost as a joke, I mentioned Celine's mysterious old alias, half expecting Odessa to laugh it off as ordinary freelancer paperwork. She didn't laugh. "Julian, that's not how LLC invoicing usually works. If your wife's name is showing up differently on formal documents, that's not a business quirk. That's either a legal name change somewhere or something a lot more complicated." She offered casually to run a basic public records search, the kind she did for work all the time. I told her not to bother. I wasn't ready yet to formally go looking for something I was afraid I already suspected. I regret that hesitation more than almost anything else in this story. The night everything came apart started like any ordinary Tuesday. Celine told me she had a work event 2 hours outside the city and wouldn't be home until late. I didn't think much of it. I fell asleep on the couch watching television and woke to my phone buzzing against the coffee table at 2:14 in the morning. "Julian," she whispered when I answered, her voice cracked and unsteady in a way I genuinely never heard from her before. "Please, don't tell anyone where I am." "Where are you, Celine?" I asked, sitting up fully now, adrenaline cutting through the fog of sleep. "I can't explain right now. Please don't tell anyone I called you. Not your mom, not my mom, not anyone. Promise me." Something in her voice, some raw, unfamiliar panic beneath the crying, made the trained part of my brain go quiet and calculating in a way I wasn't proud of, even in the moment. "I wasn't planning to," I said, and I meant something entirely different by it than she probably understood in her panic. I hung up. I didn't call anyone that night. I didn't call her back, didn't text, didn't drive out looking for her. I lay in the dark until the sky outside our bedroom window slowly turned gray, replaying that phone call, feeling something in me shift permanently from concerned husband into something colder, more precise. Something closer to the version of myself I usually only brought to work. The knock came at 9 the next morning. I opened the door expecting a delivery or possibly a neighbor. Instead, a man in a plain gray jacket stood on my porch, a leather folder tucked under one arm, glancing briefly at a clipboard before looking up at me directly. "Julian Marsh? That's me." "I need you to sign for this," he said, holding out a manila envelope. "Federal Process Server. This is a formal notice." I signed without fully registering what I was agreeing to, my eyes already on the return address printed in the corner, a federal courthouse 2 states away, in Nevada. I opened the envelope standing right there on the porch, still barefoot, the morning air cold against my skin in a way that somehow matched exactly what I was reading. Inside was a formal notice regarding an active federal investigation into loan fraud, listing my name as a co-signer on 3 separate lines of credit I had never applied for, never signed for, and had genuinely never heard of, all opened under the name Celine Renfield, using documentation that listed our home address as the primary residence. The total came to just over $94,000. I called Odessa before I even finished reading the second page. "I need that background search now," I said. "The full one. Whatever you can legally pull." What Odessa found over the following 2 days rearranged nearly everything I thought I understood about the last 7 years of my life. Celine Cordero, it turned out, wasn't entirely a fabricated identity, but it also wasn't the whole story. 9 years earlier, before I'd ever met her, she'd been legally married in Nevada to a man named Foster Renfield, a marriage that, according to every public record Odessa could pull, had never actually been dissolved. No divorce filing existed anywhere in the county system, which meant, under Nevada and Arizona law both, our own marriage 5 years earlier had never been legally valid to begin with. That explained the second name in that folder in her car. That explained the $800 withdrawal to F. Renfield, which wasn't a refunded venue deposit at all, but a payment to a man she was apparently still legally tied to, possibly still quietly involved with, in some capacity Odessa's records couldn't fully clarify. And the loans, the $94,000 of fraud with my name attached, had been opened over the previous 18 months using our shared address and, according to the federal notice, a signature that forensic document analysis had already flagged as inconsistent with my actual handwriting. Celine hadn't just lied about one night. She'd been legally married to another man the entire time she was married to me, and she'd been quietly building fraudulent debt in my name to fund whatever double life that first marriage still required. I sat in my kitchen for a long time after Odessa finished laying it all out, feeling something settle into place that was colder and steadier than rage. 9 years of professional training kicked in almost automatically. I stopped thinking like a betrayed husband and started thinking like an investigator building a case. Celine came home 2 days later, late in the evening, looking exhausted and hollowed out in a way I'd never seen on her before. She found me sitting at the kitchen table, the federal notice laid out in front of me along with Odessa's printed research, everything organized the way I'd organize evidence for any other fraud case at work. She stopped in the doorway when she saw it. "Julian," she said carefully, "I can explain." "You can," I agreed, keeping my voice level, the same tone I used in interview rooms at work when I already knew the answer and simply needed the other person to admit it out loud. "I'd actually like to hear you try." She sat down slowly across from me, and over the next hour in pieces, she told me a version of the truth. Foster Renfield wasn't an old boyfriend or a forgotten mistake. He was, and apparently remained, her legal husband, a man she'd never actually divorced because doing so, she claimed, would have exposed an earlier fraud case tied to his own business, one she said she'd been protecting herself from being implicated in by staying quietly, legally attached to him on paper while building an entirely separate life with me under a name close enough to her real one that most casual checks would never catch the discrepancy. The loans, she admitted, had been open to cover payments Foster demanded from her to keep his own silence about her role in that original fraud case years ago, before I'd ever met her. The 2 a.m. call had come from a motel 2 hours outside the city, where she'd gone to meet him after he threatened to expose everything unless she paid him one final time. "I was trying to protect you," she said, her voice breaking. "If any of this came out, you'd have been dragged into it too." "I was already dragged into it," I said quietly, gesturing at the $94,000 of fraudulent debt sitting on the table between us. "You just made sure I found out on your terms instead of mine." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw anything, didn't storm out, didn't do any of the things I imagined she might have braced herself for. Instead, I told her calmly that I'd already filed a formal report with the federal investigators handling the loan fraud case, providing Odessa's research and my own analysis of the forged signatures. I told her I'd contacted a lawyer that same afternoon to begin the process of having our marriage formally declared void, given that it had never been legal to begin with. And I told her finally that I had no intention of protecting her from consequences she'd spent years quietly building on my behalf without my knowledge. "You asked me not to tell anyone where you were," I said, standing up from the table. "I kept that promise exactly. I never told anyone where you were that night. I just made sure everyone eventually found out what you'd been doing while you were there." I watched something in her face finally understand, fully, what kind of husband 9 years of fraud investigation training had actually made me. It's been 3 weeks now since that conversation at the kitchen table. The federal investigation into Celine's loans is ongoing, and according to the process server who's kept me loosely updated, Foster Renfield is facing separate charges of his own, unrelated to me, tied to that original fraud case he was apparently still running quietly on the side. My lawyer confirmed what Odessa's research suggested. Our marriage was never legally valid, which strange as it sounds, has actually simplified an otherwise messy situation considerably. There's no divorce to finalize. There's simply a truth that finally caught up to 5 years of careful, deliberate omission. Celine has reached out a handful of times since, always with some version of the same request, a chance to explain further, a chance to make it right privately, a chance for me to quietly step back and let her handle the consequences on her own timeline, the way she'd clearly hoped to all along. I haven't responded, not out of cruelty, though I understand it might look that way from the outside. I responded exactly the way she asked me to that night on the phone. I didn't tell anyone where she was. I simply stopped protecting the silence that had let her build an entire second life inside the one she shared with me. People sometimes ask when I tell pieces of this story whether I regret handling it so calmly, whether some louder, angrier response might have felt more satisfying in the moment. I don't think it would have. Anger burns fast and leaves you with nothing but ash and an unfinished case. What actually worked, what actually mattered, was doing exactly what 9 years of training taught me to do with anyone else who'd built a lie this elaborate, gathering the truth carefully, documenting it precisely, and letting the weight of that truth do the work. Rage never quite manages to finish on its own. If there's a lesson in any of this, it's a quiet one. Real accountability rarely looks like shouting. It looks like someone finally deciding to stop covering for you and simply letting the truth arrive exactly where it was always headed. If someone in your life ever asks you, in a moment of panic, to protect the location of a lie they're currently living inside, you don't owe them your silence. You owe yourself the truth, however long it takes to find it, and however calm you have to stay while you're building the case that finally proves it. I kept my word to Celine that night. I never told anyone where she was. I just made sure the truth found its own way to everyone who needed to hear it, including me. So I'll leave you with the question I still think about most, even now. If you discovered the person you built your entire life around had been quietly living a second one this whole time, would you have handled it the calm, methodical way I did? Or would you have needed to confront it loudly, right there in the moment, just to feel like the truth was actually yours to hold? Let me know honestly what you would have done in the comments below. I read every single one.
Thanks for watching this story and thank you support me. Bye bye.